Thomas, and I'm here today from a medical practice, a new medical practice called Sunday Health. Sunday Health. We have the table right out front with information if you're interested after you hear from us today. We are a relatively new group practice. We started at the beginning of 2024. We are licensed to practice in Virginia, DC, and Maryland. We operate a fully telehealth practice today. What does that mean? That means if you'd like to see us or like to see Dr. Sanders, who you're going to hear from shortly, you would see us on a computer or an iPad via Zoom. So that's where we are today. And what do we do? Well, Sunday Health focuses on brain health and specifically your cognition, meaning your memory and thinking skills. And Dr. Sanders will tell you a lot more about that today. So speaking of Dr. Sanders, she is our guest speaker today. She is a dementia neurologist, so a brain doctor. That's how I think of her, a brain doctor. She received both an MD and an MS in clinical research methods, the latter, the MS, from Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York. Dr. Sanders also completed a residency in neurology at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and she went on to become a practicing neurologist at both Albert Einstein and SUNY Upstate in New York. And then from there, she went over to Hartford, Connecticut, where she helped to start a memory care clinic that became part of Hartford Healthcare. And she did that for about 5 years. She'll tell you more, I'm sure. We feel very fortunate to have Dr. Sanders as part of our practice, as our specialized dementia neurologist, because she has about 15 years of working with patients and their care partners as they have concerns or live with cognitive decline. So this afternoon, Maria, you can think of me as the candy lady. I have the bowl of candy out front. We'll be asking Dr. Sanders a number of questions, and she will share her knowledge with you. We plan to allow enough time during our presentation to have all of you ask the questions that are on your minds as well. So before I bring Dr. Sanders up, I wanted to thank Jessica Fredrickson, who was kind enough to invite us here today. Jessica, I think many of you know, is the director of brain health at Goodwin and runs the StrongerMemory program. And she's going to just say a few words and then we'll get started.
Thank you. Thanks, Maria and Dr. Sanders, for being here. We're really excited to have a dementia specialist, neurologist, come and talk to all of you. They're coming here just to share this great knowledge and share about the services they can offer. As you might know, we do have StrongerMemory here, supported through the Goodwin Living Foundation, which is simple brain activities engaged in the prefrontal cortex, reading aloud, writing by hand, and doing simple math. Not going to talk too much about this. I know a lot of you are a part of our group that meets on Mondays at 1 p.m. So we just want to say thank you to everyone who is here. A huge thank you to Sunday Health, to Maria and Dr. Sanders. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Maria.
Thanks so much, Jessica. So Dr. Sanders, if you want to try to start making your way to the stage, and please be careful about these wires. And while Dr. Sanders is coming up, this is our Sunday Health team. In addition to Dr. Sanders, we have a Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Clay Ackerley, who's a practicing GP in Washington, D.C. He works with us as a clinical advisor. We have several very experienced and delightful nurse practitioners, Kelly and Mallory and Sarah. Sarah is a specialized advanced geriatric nurse practitioner. And so in addition to Dr. Sanders, who specializes in neurology and is a neurologist, we also have these nurse practitioners. So as you may know, June is Alzheimer's and Brain Awareness Month. And if you've been following the news, you may have also been following recently that there have been a number of developments around new diagnostic tools, new drugs, new research all related to mild cognitive impairment and dementia. And so there's a lot to talk about today. We're really thrilled to get started with you. And to get us underway, I'm going to put us back on the topic of the day, which is what are normal changes in memory and thinking as we age? And so when we say that, it does beg the question, what's normal and then what's not? So I thought, Dr. Sanders, to get started, before we get into cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's or dementia, maybe we should just start with some basics, including perhaps an explanation of the brain structure and brain function. So what is sort of some basic brain structure 101 and types of thinking?
Okay. Well, StrongerMemory sort of teed this up for me because they already used the words prefrontal cortex. Yeah, and I saw that puppy dog as I was coming in. Hello, puppy dog. I'm sorry. I want everybody to put at least one hand on their forehead. I want everybody to put one hand very close. That's so if you could sink your fingers through your frontal bone into your brain, you would be putting your fingers into your prefrontal cortex. Don't worry, it wouldn't hurt. The brain does not have any pain receptors itself. How many of you have a general picture in mind of what a brain looks like? Don't be shy if you don't. All right, I see some of this. All right. So, can you picture in your mind's eye a boxing glove? Yes. So, right, with the thumb especially. So, the frontal lobes live right behind the frontal bone. The frontal lobes are the biggest lobes of the brain. So the brain is subdivided into several lobes. The frontal lobes, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe. And then there's this little thing called the cerebellum that looks like a ballerina bun on the back of your head, if you've seen brain pictures before. It's kind of like looks a little separate from all the rest, but it just sits right back there. And it's what allowed Maria to be well balanced as she walked up the stairs. That's one of the things that our cerebellum does. It does a whole lot of things for our cognition, and I will be talking about none of those today. If you put your hand kind of here, sort of toward the back of your head, not all the way back, then your hand will be right above your parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe allows for processing of sensory information. So if anybody's wearing sneakers and your toe itches, you know about that because of your parietal lobe. In the back of the brain, in a structural decision that I have never understood, lies the occipital lobe, which is where most of the visual processing happens. Vision happens here in the eye, which actually is part of the brain. Most people don't know that, but it is considered part of the brain. So you could also put your finger in your eye. I don't recommend it. But so why have the visual processing center at the back of your head when vision comes in through the front of your head? I don't know. And I've studied those visual pathways and studied those visual pathways for every test I've ever had to take. I'm not a neuro-ophthalmologist because I have very bad parietal lobes. So the other thing that the parietal lobe does is help us with navigation and knowing where we are in space. I have a theory that I have the world's smallest parietal lobes because I have the world's worst sense of direction. And then we get to the thumb. Thumbs up from everybody. Yay, all right. Why do I like the thumb? Because if you picture that boxing glove, the thumb is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe contributes a little bit to language, contributes a lot to auditory processing. So I love me some Beethoven, and I thank my temporal lobes for letting me process Beethoven's Ode to Joy, for example. But what I really love about the temporal lobes is what happens in the medial temporal lobes. Now I want you to imagine putting your fingers in your ears, and if you could do that, and insert your finger about to your first knuckle, your fingers would be more or less, remember bad sense of direction, but would be more or less in your hippocampi. So the hippocampi, one on each side, so hippocampus, both sides is the hippocampi. That's where memory processing starts. It's a little structure about the size of a grape, right in your medial temporal lobe. Healthy ones are about the size of a grape. When somebody's not healthy, and if they have a disease that affects their memory, like Alzheimer's disease, but increasingly we have other ones now too, oh goody, right? That's the last thing that we needed, but when you have a disease that affects memory, your hippocampus can show that to the world on things like an MRI machine, where it doesn't look like a nice, healthy, juicy grape. It looks like a shriveled up little raisin. So, but if you have raisins, we can help you. There are not, raisins are not the end of the world. People used to think, and my specialty, neurology, really had a bad rap for this, that we were all about diagnose and adios. We could tell you what was wrong with you, and we couldn't help you deal with it at all. Those days, my friends, I am happy to tell you, are over. O-V-E-R, rear view mirror. This is a paradigm shifting, exhilarating, mildly terrifying moment in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So we have disease-modifying medications, 2 of them now, and we have much better diagnostics.
Dr. Sanders,
That was
could I interrupt just
You
one second?
certainly may, because I tend to go on.
Before you go to the new diagnostics, which are very exciting, and the new drugs, you used a lot of big words, and I just want to make sure I got some of them. So basically,
It's so hard not to do that.
what I heard was there's a lot of different parts of your brain, and they're in different sections, you pointed to them, and they control different cognitive functions, like balance you mentioned,
Right.
and like direction. And there was another one, you see, I already forgot it. There was some kind of thinking and of course memory. So these would be, would I be correct in saying these would be cognitive functions?
These are cognitive functions, and the brain subdivides itself into areas that are specialized for one cognitive function or another. So your frontal lobes, those allow you to engage in planning ahead, decision making. StrongerMemory mentioned a little bit of arithmetic. I bet that's everybody's favorite subject, right? But that's what your frontal lobes allow you to do calculations, to pay attention, to use ultra short-term memory called working memory. That's actually a frontal lobe function. You can imagine it as the kind of memory that you need to keep, back in the days when we actually dialed telephones, to keep a telephone number sort of online in your brain long enough to dial the number, and then you could dump it. That's working memory. You use it for ultra short-term things. So the thought bubble, and then the thought bubble just sort of dissolves, as bubbles are wont to do. So that's mostly what the frontal lobes do. The temporal lobes, and the frontal lobes also are involved in language. Sorry, frontal lobes. Didn't mean to offend you there. The temporal lobes, language, auditory, hearing processing, and memory. The parietal lobes, navigation, spatial orientation, sensory dynamics, let's call them. And then the occipital lobe for mostly visual processing, and the cerebellum for coordinated movement. So if I do this, I have extended my arm, and I've used my extensors to do that, but my flexors, which are on the other side and do the opposite thing, have to know sort of to be relaxed and not get in the way. So Flexing, my extensors are relaxed. Now my flexors are relaxed. So that's what the kind of stuff that the cerebellum does.
So thank you for that. And so I'm hearing there's cognition as a word, and that controls a lot of different kinds of brain functions. And so when we talk about cognitive aging, what are we talking about when we say cognitive aging?
Right. Who has bad knees? Who has bad hips? Oh, I'm sorry.
Bad hips.
Bad hips. Who has a bad back? Okay. Who has gray hair? Who has a few wrinkles? Are you sensing a theme? Body systems age. Aging begins the moment that we get slapped on the hiney in the labor and delivery room and draw our first breath. By the time we've drawn our second breath, we're already aging. In terms of cognition, which is a $10 word for thinking, all of the things that we need to do for thinking, and I could put up lists of things that we need to do that include, or that fall under the heading of thinking, but they're all familiar to you. Paying attention, focusing, concentrating, planning ahead, switching from one thing to another. We'll bit more about that later. Remembering things, using language, understanding words, being able to repeat things, being able to sing a song, make decisions. These are all cognitive acts. And your brain ages the same way that the rest of your body does. And so where the hair ages, and we can see it change from a beautiful brown or bright red or whatever it was to a gray, or the lucky ones, a pure white that's so, so beautiful. So hair ages. The brain also ages. The way that hair's color changes is we have an analogous thing in cognitive aging. Things do not stay the same for the vast majority of us. There are a very, very few, a very small, lucky group of people who experience no cognitive change as they get older. That is not pathological, but it's also not normal. We call that successful cognitive aging. It's really interesting stuff, but not very many people get to experience it. Most of us experience typical cognitive aging. So, has anybody ever walked into the kitchen? Why am I in here again? Here's a tip. If you walk back out through the kitchen, this works especially well if you have an old-fashioned kitchen that is its own room with a door that has its own door jamb. If you cross that, there's research that shows that can help it pop back into your head, the thing you wanted in the kitchen. So maybe it was a glass of milk, maybe it was a rolling pin, who knows. It was in the kitchen, you couldn't remember, you walked back out, jogged your memory, and it came back to you. That is a normal feature of cognitive aging. Why it works to leave the room and come back in, this I do not know, but I have read that does work. So you take that tip and use it as your own. If you lose your keys, I just saw somebody roll their eyes. Yes, in my house, we have fixed this problem. We have a key bowl. And it is as we come through the mudroom hallway, turn into the kitchen, there's the key bowl. I almost never lose my keys anymore because they go in the key bowl. That's an adaptive strategy for a cognitive change that comes from not being able to pay attention automatically any longer. So you have to make a conscious effort to pay attention. That's one of the things that is different about us when we're 75 than when we were, say, 35 or 45, maybe even 55.
So what I'm hearing, and I want you to make sure I'm hearing this correctly, is that there are some things that are normal parts of cognitive aging, such as I walked into the room and immediately forgot what I came into the room for. Or maybe I'm occasionally misplacing my glasses or my keys. That could very well and likely be normal cognitive aging. If I start putting my car keys in the freezer, in the ice box, and then I do that repeatedly, am I starting to have something to worry about?
That's not so normal.
Okay.
So
let me generalize the question, because I just gave you an example without asking a question. So you've made it clear that the brain ages like the rest of the body. You've given us some examples of what is normal cognitive aging. So I think the question that's on my mind and maybe on some of your minds is, then what's not normal? How do I know I have behaviors that maybe aren't normal?
with your permission, I'm going to back up a little bit and just review a couple of other things that are normal for cognitive aging. I've mentioned that you have to make a concerted effort to focus. You may have noticed that you don't multitask as well as you used to. And guess what? Your brain never thanked you for multitasking. If you are doing task A at a certain level and task B at a certain level, and you try to do tasks A and B together, their performance level will drop for both task A and task B. There's mountains of cognitive neuroscience, lots of very sexy research carried out by a bunch of people with PhDs that show us that the brain never likes to do more than one thing. We can do that pretty easily when we're 35, 45, maybe even 55. But as we get older, it does get a little harder. Just as my knees are stiff, in that way you might think of my brain as being a little stiff. You can do it, and this is the theme. This is the theme of normal cognitive aging. You can do it, but it's a little harder than it used to be. It takes a little longer than it used to be. So the example that I used to give here was learning to program a VCR. How many of you still have a VCR? I see a couple of shy hands going up, but most of us have moved on to even more complicated things like streaming platforms and that sort of thing. But learning to do a new task is harder, but you can still do it. Just takes longer and maybe is a little bit more irritating. So processing slows down a little bit, attention requires more effort, multitasking is considerably more difficult than it used to be. Those are all parts of what we call dynamic or fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, or things like vocabulary, these things remain in pretty good shape for a pretty long time because they are crystallized. So they tend not to fluctuate as much. So, what have I not yet mentioned? I heard somebody say dementia, and you're on the right track.
Wait, someone over here, what?
The way to control it.
The way to control it, she said.
That's kind of the second half of the talk. Are things that you can do to support your aging brain.
So what has she not mentioned, sir?
Remembering names.
Remembering names.
Okay, well, yes, so that's a really, really good example of something that brings many people to see me. I saw this person in the supermarket, I hadn't seen her in 3 years, and I couldn't remember her name. This must be the beginning of the end, right? Wrong. It's good news that it's wrong. But so that's an excellent example of something that we call the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And I have a funny story related to the tip of the tongue phenomenon, but I want to focus first on not names, but the other word that you used, remembering. I have not talked about memory as part of normal cognitive aging. Memory loss is not, let's say that again, memory loss is not a part of normal cognitive aging. if we were having this conversation 30 years ago, I might well have told you that memory loss was part of normal cognitive aging. And it's so ingrained in me now that it's not normal that I had to give a big presentation a few years ago where I had to go back and you know, when did we first talk about this in a different way? And I was shocked that it was as recently as 30 years ago. But it is, you know, the early to mid 1990s is when we really began to understand that memory loss is always part of an underlying disease process. That's the bad news. The good news is that that disease process often takes years, usually, in fact, decades, plural, an S at the end of decades, more than one, before actual symptoms become evident in a person. This is one thing that we have learned over, one of the many things that we have learned over the last 10 to 15 years. So what is not normal? Memory loss.
Thank you. Can you tell the funny story? Does it involve Billie Jean King?
It in fact does, yes.
How did I know?
So, yes, poor Maria, she may have heard this story before. So, I'm gonna jump into the Wayback Machine here, so our cartoon reference there, and we're gonna go back to about 2003. So what is that, 21 years ago? I was a resident. I was in residency training, which means I was exhausted all the time. It was a Friday night. This was before smartphones gave us instant access to the entire compendium of human knowledge. And there was no way that I was going to the library. I was too tired. I could not remember, and why I cared about it on a Friday night, this is lost in the mist of times, but whom did Billie Jean King beat in the Battle of the Sexes tennis tournament in the early 1970s? You all knew it.
Bobby Riggs.
Bobby Riggs. So I suffered for an entire weekend, racking my brain, trying to remember this man's name. That was my first mistake. I should have just tried to quit thinking about it. That's much more likely to bring it forward. Finally, it's Sunday night, and I just can't stand it anymore. So I called my know-it-all brother-in-law. And as know-it-all brother-in-laws are wont to do, he said, "Oh, you mean Bobby Riggs?" I will never forget that man's name again. But I tell this story a lot because it's good evidence. I was 40-something at the time, and that was probably my first tip of the tongue phenomenon. And it didn't ever come back to me. I had to seek help. So when you have that tip of the tongue phenomenon, and is there anybody in this room who has not ever experienced that feeling? Nope.
Thank you for that. And could I bring us back to what you were saying just before Billie Jean King? So you started talking about memory, and you said that memory loss is not part of normal cognitive aging.
Correct.
And then you talked a little, I think you used the word disease or diseases. And so I'm wondering, maybe you could just touch on, when we think of disease or diseases related to memory, what are we talking about?
What are we talking about? What's the disease that affects memory the most? Alzheimer's disease, yes. And I hate Alzheimer's disease. It's not a polite word to use in polite conversation, but I do. I hate it. Nothing would make me happier than for us to have a cure tomorrow that would put me out of business. We're not there yet, but we have made progress. So memory loss, though, does not always or instantly, not an and an or, mean Alzheimer's disease. There are other diseases that impact memory. There's now something called LATE. That's an acronym that I can never remember, but it basically means that there's a different protein in the brain that has kind of gone rogue, and it causes a phenomenon called LATE. that looks very similar to, but has certain important differences from Alzheimer's disease, which is caused by, in part, amyloid protein that has kind of gone rogue, and tau, a form of tau protein that has also gone rogue. We think that actually Alzheimer's disease is very much a multifactorial process, many moving pieces to cause Alzheimer's disease. Also, and you may hear about this, especially watch the news in about a month, because in about a month is the big annual International Alzheimer's Disease Research Meeting, and they may be changing the diagnostic paradigm, the diagnostic categories that we use, what you need to have in order to make the diagnosis, that will change our understanding of Alzheimer's disease from something that you sort of transition into when your cognition breaks down in more than one area: attention, memory, language, reasoning and decision making, and visual and spatial abilities. Those are the big 5 areas. And if memory is affected, and affected to such a degree that it is preventing a person from functioning independently on their own, without help, in their lives, those are the only criteria that you need for the dementia syndrome. Cognition failing, causing functional decline. Alzheimer's disease is maybe going to be rejiggered as something that is more like atherosclerosis. It's so in atherosclerosis, you get plaque in your arteries. And we know that there are 18-year-olds out there walking around, healthy, vigorous, robust 18-year-olds, but they already have plaque in their arteries. It was one of the most surprising things I learned when I went to medical school. So some of the changes that may ultimately lead to a clinical picture of Alzheimer's dementia may start changing in the brain decades before the Alzheimer's dementia emerges. So like atherosclerosis is the underlying disease process that eventually culminates in a heart attack. In Alzheimer's disease, we're going to have Alzheimer's pathology that ultimately culminates in Alzheimer's dementia, cognitive failing causing functional decline. That's a huge and somewhat controversial change.
Dr. Sanders, could you explain the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia?
I would love to, because this is not well understood. So dementia is a syndrome. A syndrome is not a disease, it's a collection of symptoms. And the ones that you need for dementia are cognitive decline, significant or severe enough to cause functional decline. The end. That's all that you need to be considered to be somebody who has the dementia syndrome. Cancer is also a syndrome. If you hear that your high school chum was recently diagnosed with cancer, what is your next question likely to be? What kind? Thank you. You answered all of that like a reflex, and I heard it from pretty much everybody. So if you hear that a high school chum has dementia, most people do not ask what kind, but they should, because there are close to 100, and someday I'm going to actually count up the number of conditions and disease states that can produce the dementia syndrome. By leaps and bounds, by huge margins, Alzheimer's disease is the most common disease that causes the dementia syndrome. But it is never sufficient to say that somebody has dementia. It is never sufficient to say that somebody has cancer. You have to know more than just that. And the same holds true with dementia. So tell all your friends, please.
So, Dr. Sanders, sometimes we hear the term mild cognitive impairment, also known as MCI. How does that relate to both Alzheimer's and the dementia syndrome?
So MCI is quite literally an invented diagnosis. There's a very, very smart neurologist at the Mayo Clinic with the best head of shocking white hair I've ever seen. His name is Ron Peterson, Peterson, S-E-N at the end. And about 30 years ago, he had the insight that nobody goes to bed on a Monday night with normal cognition for their age and wakes up on Tuesday morning with full-blown Alzheimer's disease. That can happen with the common cold. That can happen with the flu. But it never, there are very few absolutes in medicine, but this is one of them. It never happens that way with Alzheimer's disease. So he said, well, that means that there must be some sort of transition state that people pass through from when they have typical cognitive aging, and things are maybe a little bit worse. And he defines some specific criteria. You have to go to your doctor's office and say, Doc, my memory or my ability to make decisions or my ability to use language, you have to have a complaint about your thinking, a subjective complaint. You or your loved ones have noticed it. You have to have objective evidence of cognitive impairment. That means that you have some pretty detailed cognitive testing because they have to compare your performance in whatever type of thinking is being tested to people who we know are normal, have normal cognition for age, for that type of thinking. And in order to be objectively impaired, you must be 2 standard deviations, just think of them as arithmetic units, away from the mean. Everybody remember the bell curve from high school? Looks like this. So what I'm talking about, so this is peak performance, but when you're in the bad end over here, that's impairment. So you have to have some pretty significant cognitive changes in order to reach that threshold of having objective cognitive impairment. You cannot be demented. And interestingly, and this is the one that gets ignored the most, you must have normal function, normal scores on a general cognitive screening test. Anybody ever do the MoCA test? That's a cognitive screening test. The mini mental state exam, there are lots and lots of them. But your performance, in order to have mild cognitive impairment, you have to have normal performance on a MoCA or some sort of equivalent test. So the full thing is that you have to have a subjective complaint, objective evidence of impairment, no dementia, and normal performance on a cognitive screening test. Dr. Peterson conceived of MCI as a transition state through which people pass on their way to dementia. So you've fallen off your growth curve a little bit, you're no longer part of the normal, the typical cognitive aging trajectory. Your line has become a little steeper. Something is now officially impaired, but you can still drive, cook for yourself, make a shopping list, plan a party, manage your finances, manage your medications. You do not yet have functional decline. Things may be harder, but you can still get there in the end. That's mild cognitive impairment. It's really not very well understood, even in the medical community.
I see that there's a question. I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. But Dr. Sanders, you talked about this bell curve and having normal results on a test like a MoCA. It suggested to me, and I want to ask you if this is correct, that it's important to have a baseline of your brain functioning in order to have something to compare it to later.
Yes. So, if there were a soapbox here, I would be climbing up upon it. Actually, I probably wouldn't. My knees don't let me do that anymore. But this is something that is very, very near and dear to my heart. If I were king of the world, and there are all kinds of reasons that that's not likely to happen anytime soon, but if I were king of the world, thank you for laughing, everybody would undergo a cognitive baseline assessment when they're 35 years old. Anybody here have that? Anybody here undergo? You did? Why?
At 35.
At 35?
Well, I was a little older than that, but I did go through that, yeah.
Okay. So what I'm talking about here is not,
Mainly because it was in my family.
okay. That's
She said it was because it was in her family, which is an important point, yeah.
So you're the poster child for what should happen and usually doesn't. So thank you for that. Why? Why do I say 35? Well, we want to get a sense of what maximum ability a person had. Why do I say they would have that at 35? Well, it takes until the 20s for your brain to be fully physically mature. Put the fist on the forehead again. It's those frontal lobes that mature the last. And when I say mature here, I'm talking about they get the full growth of neurons. They undergo other processes that sort of make more precise the way that neurons talk to one another, and a number of other things as well, including myelination. So myelin is you can think of it as like the brain's superconductor stuff. It wraps around the processes of neurons. So imagine that Maria is a neuron and I'm a neuron. So Maria,
My imitation of a neuron.
yes. So she's being a very, very good neuronal cell body. So extend your hand like this, if you would. Don't quite touch mine though. So what Maria and I have made is a synapse. So this is the way, and some of you out there know that. You knew where I was going with this. This is how neurons talk to one another. So we spit neurotransmitter molecules at each other, and that's how communication happens. And all of that changes as people finally mature. And the neuronal processes were our arms. And myelin wraps around those processes so that the information that needs to be communicated can be communicated as rapidly as it needs to be. And back when I was resident, I could have given you velocity. I don't remember.
That was fun. Thank you for that, Dr.
Yes.
Sanders. There's a couple more things I want to make sure we get to, but first I'm going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So don't let me forget, I think we should talk about what folks could do to keep their brains healthy. But for now, there was already a question, the gentleman over here. And Jessica, do you want to take my mic?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Who had the question? Back here? Okay.
This has to do with the measure of cognitive impairment. If you have scored 2 standard deviations from the norm, how can you pass the general test? It's also part of the, in other words, on one particular scale, if you fail that in the general test, aren't you going to fail the test?
Not necessarily. So it depends on what that failed area was. But you pointed out one of the things that always kind of makes my brain go squeak a little bit about those criteria. But the bigger point, I think, is that, and this is a different soapbox, the MOCA or whatever is a screening test. It's a general test, so it tests a number of different thinking abilities, but it doesn't go into depth on any of those thinking abilities. And the general rule in medicine, and probably other fields as well, is if screening is abnormal, you do not make a diagnosis. You proceed to confirmatory testing. And it's in this confirmatory testing, what we call domain-specific cognitive testing. Attention, that's a domain. Memory is a domain. Language is a domain. So attention, memory, language, reasoning and decision-making, and visual spatial abilities. When you have the more detailed testing that you really should have, that's how it's broken down. And then you may see, in fact, that somebody just was having a bad day when they didn't score particularly well on the MOCA or whatever. So sort of built into Dr. Peterson's criteria is this scientific notion of screening and then confirmatory testing.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Excellent.
Are there other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes.
Have they found any risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and is it inherited at all?
Did Maria plant you in the audience, sir? Those are great questions, and probably questions that you are not alone in wondering about.
No.
End of the sentence with preposition. So, are there risk factors? Yes. Some of them we can control, some of them we cannot. Is it inherited? Yes, but no. How's that for a helpful answer? So, what are some of the risk factors? Well, the biggest one is age, and that certainly is on the list of factors that we cannot control. Family history, which is a sort of introduction to the idea of genetic predisposition. So in some very rare cases, Alzheimer's disease is inherited. You need to have a genetic mutation in order for that to be the case. Genetic mutations are destiny. If you have one of the disease-causing genetic mutations for Alzheimer's disease, you will get Alzheimer's disease. Anybody here ever heard of ApoE? A few hands. Pretty smart audience. I would have expected more, so I'm happy I get to teach you something. ApoE is not a destiny gene. ApoE is a gene. It's a very, very important gene for Alzheimer's disease. You are going to hear much more about it in the future, and I probably mean the near future, because now we can, and in certain particular circumstances, indeed should find out what a given individual's ApoE status is. Who loves Neapolitan ice cream? Okay, a couple hands. How many people like chocolate the best? All right, let's go with chocolate as, we're going to call that E2. Vanilla is by definition the most boring of the flavors. So we're going to call that E3, because E3 is neutral. And then strawberry is going to be E4. So who cares? Well, you get an E from each of your parents. So it's a little particular spot on the gene where there can be one of three different varieties, three different versions: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. And you get either, or any, you get A and E. So either chocolate, vanilla, strawberry from dad, and either chocolate, vanilla, strawberry from mom. So you wind up with some combination of vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. If you are chocolate, both mom and dad give you a chocolate, boy are you lucky. And you are very uncommon as well. I have not ever seen this genotype, ever. But chocolate is protective against Alzheimer's disease. Vanilla, that's a big yawner. Doesn't influence your disease likelihood one way or the other. Strawberry that's a different situation. So when you have, if you're a strawberry, you will probably, not for sure, but probably get Alzheimer's disease. I say not for sure because there are individuals who have been studied, strawberry, 95 years or older, and a shockingly high number of them smoked and drank, and they didn't go very far in school, and had a lot of stress in their lives, and they're strawberry, and they're in their late 90s, and they are completely normal in their cognition. Those people do exist. They must have some sort of protective factor. We haven't found it yet. I really want to know what it is. But, so, and then if you are chocolate strawberry, then your risk is variable, really hard to predict. But ApoE is all about risk and vulnerability. It's not about destiny. So, and there are now medications for Alzheimer's disease when it's mild, and MCI when it's pretty well as confirmed as it could be that it's due to Alzheimer's disease, where it's going to be important to know a person's ApoE status before prescribing that medication, because people who are strawberry face a different side effect profile than people who are vanilla or chocolate. So that was a long sort of digression into genetic predisposition.
Dr. Sanders, I just wanted to pick up on, he also asked at first about risk factors.
Yep.
And during your explanation, you mentioned that there are 95-year-olds who are smoking, and I forget what else, but are there specific lifestyle-related controllable choices that people could make to improve their brain health?
In a word, you betcha. So, in terms of risk factors, there are also risk factors that we can indeed change. In fact, there is a large group of people who take, dementia neurologists like me and also dementia researchers who believe that the way that we are going to lick this dreadful disease, Alzheimer's disease, is not by curing it, not by treating it, but by preventing it. And we have learned more and more in recent years, and this is really a galloping area of research, about how important lifestyle factors are in preventing or reducing risk. So certainly, don't smoke. Increasingly, don't drink. If I were having this conversation with you last year, I would have said, drinking in moderation. Men should never have, should try to aim for not more than 2 a day. Women should try to aim for not more than 1 a day. Red wine is probably best, but, all things in moderation. And now, whatever guideline or federal government body it is that tells us how much alcohol we should be able to have, they're on the verge of saying no amount is safe. So that's a big change. Vision and hearing, super important, super ignored risk factors, especially untreated hearing loss. So there's no way that if I develop hearing loss that I will let it go, because I have to be able to listen to Beethoven's Ode to Joy. But if I also want to be able to continue to enjoy my trashy fiction at night before I go to bed, hearing. How many people have not yet had their hearing evaluated? I see a few brave people who are raising their hands. You know now what your homework is. Please call your primary care practice and say, I was at this talk yesterday, and boy, that neurologist, she really convinced me how important it is to get my hearing checked. If you can't hear, you are cut off from everything that's going on around you. And it's a slippery slope because the changes happen very, very gradually. But this is a well-established risk factor for dementia, not just Alzheimer's disease, but for dementia in general. And it's one that many people don't address. Diet. How many people here have heard of the Mediterranean diet? Yeah, I thought just about every hand would go up. So I'm not going to talk about the Mediterranean diet. What I'm going to tell you about is ultra-processed foods. Everybody know what that is, what that means? Most of you do, yes. Do you know how ultra-processed foods affect your risk for Alzheimer's disease in particular, but other dementias too? Well, I didn't. And almost 2 years ago now, at the big annual Alzheimer's meeting in late July, a paper was reported on about 11,000 participants. And the researchers went into the paper with the hypothesis that the people who ate the most ultra-processed food would have the worst impact of ultra-processed food on their cognition. Well, they did find that ultra-processed food is bad for your cognition. But what they found was that it's the other end of the spectrum. It was only the people whose diet included less than 25% from the ultra-processed food category who did not experience cognitive impairment that they felt they could link to ultra-processed food. So I first heard about that almost 2 years ago. I do not even need this many fingers to tell you how many times I've had potato chips since. And Coca-Cola, that might be a bit more of a work in progress for me. And it is baseball season, so I might have had a hot dog. But I have really, really, really tried to change the way that I shop. So other things that are, especially at this time of year when nobody really wants to get in the kitchen and make a nice long braise or something like that. Packaged foods, fast foods, convenience foods. Read your labels. You want natural stuff in there. That was a big, big change. We've known about the Mediterranean diet for a long time, but the poison that is ultra-processed foods, also soda, Coca-Cola addict here, remember, you can also get bubbles from seltzer water. So, for things that you love that are very, very bad for you, I offer you this. What's seldom is wonderful. Sleep. Sleep is also an incredibly important risk factor for cognitive decline, dementia, but also for depression, for irritability, for all kinds of other, if you have actual sleep apnea and it hasn't been treated, that's a risk factor for atrial fibrillation and stroke and all kinds of other badness. Your bedroom should be your sleep sanctuary. We learned by reading the literature for the first time, only about a dozen years ago, about something called the glymphatic system. Anybody here ever hear of the glymphatic system? Oh, people have. Wow, I am very, very impressed. Sir, how did you hear of the glymphatic system?
Daughter.
Is your daughter an Alzheimer's disease or brain researcher? No? What does she do?
Well, she had problems with it.
I see, okay. So the glymphatic system, and that's a combination word. Glia, those are the supporting cells in the brain. So the neurons are the action cells in the brain. And then there are a number of different kinds of cells that we lump together and we call them glia. And it's paired then with lymphatic. So many people are vaguely familiar, pretty much my familiarity, with the lymphatic system. So it's not your vascular system, doesn't carry blood, it carries lymph, which does other body functions for you. And in the brain, the lymphatic system, which is active when you're sleeping, clears junk out of the brain. Some of that junk that it clears is bad beta amyloid protein. So remember back 100 years ago when I mentioned that one of the proteins that goes rogue in Alzheimer's disease is amyloid protein? Bad amyloid protein gets cleared from your brain while you're sleeping by the lymphatic system. So, boy, that's an important reason. If you are not sleeping well, if you have a hard time falling asleep, if you wake up in the early hours of the morning and you cannot get back to sleep, if you snore, get your sleeping addressed. One final comment about medications. Not exactly a risk factor per se, but studies have shown that older adults average around 14 different medications. Boy, is that a lot. And oftentimes those medications do not play nicely with one another, and many, many times they have side effects that are bad for your thinking. So the big offending classes here are benzodiazepines. Those are things like Xanax, Valium, Ativan, Halcyon. Anything that has an anticholinergic side effect profile. The big ones here, bladder drugs. Anybody here take bladder drugs? Well, if you are taking bladder drugs, I hope the one that you're on is mirabegron, also known as Myrbetriq. That's the only bladder drug that does not have anticholinergic side effects. Anticholinergic side effects, remember when Maria and I were being neurons and we were spitting at each other? One of the things that gets spat is a brain chemical called acetylcholine. And if you take a bladder controlling medication that is not Myrbetriq, it will have anticholinergic side effects that will dry up the acetylcholine that Maria and I need to be able to spit at each other. So that's how those kinds of medications can interfere with brain function. And opioid pain medications, which just make you loopy. And who can think when you're loopy?
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. So we heard about the importance of sleep, about the importance of diet, and especially watching your ultra-processed foods. I'm going to add exercise, and also medications and other things that you can do to help keep your brain healthy. We are at the hour. Dr. Sanders and I are available to stay. If there are more questions, please feel free to ask. We're here for you. We can take them now, or we'll be outside the table for a few minutes. Does anybody have any final questions? Yes, ma'am. Hang on, we're going to give you a microphone. Artificial sweeteners.
What was it?
Artificial sweeteners.
Oh, artificial sweeteners.
That's a really, really good question that I'm going to go home and I'm going to dive down that rabbit hole. On the first blush, boy, you can't get any more ultra-processed than saccharin and that sort of thing. So I would, if you want a non-sugar, you want a sugar substitute, things that are natural. So stevia root, so that's the stevia, and I think also Truvia uses stevia. And I've never tried to do it because I just don't bake on general principles. Too lazy. I love to cook, but baking is a bridge too far. But I have heard that you can actually even use those sugar substitutes successfully in baking. Maybe there are other bakers in the audience who can confirm or deny. But that's a really, really good question. Thank you for asking.
Other questions? Anybody else? Ma'am, right here in front. Right here in front.
The Dr. Peterson you referred to,
Yes?
is he the author of that wonderful book called Memory?
Question, again, repeat the question.
Yes, so the question is whether Ron Peterson wrote a book called Memory, and I'm afraid that my answer is I don't know. My guess would be no, because he is a prolific prolific author in the peer-reviewed medical scientific research, which doesn't often leave time for writing more general books, but he may well have written a book.
It talks a lot
Yeah.
about exercising the brain. A lot.
So yes, cognitively stimulating activities. Thank you for jogging my memory. So Maria mentioned exercise, and physical exercise is indeed so important that yes, believe it or not, I even go to the gym and I have a personal trainer. I have a date with him at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. If you knew me better, you would know what a big statement that is, and how important it is to exercise. It doesn't matter really that or how you exercise. You do not have to become a triathlete or a marathon runner. You can do, there's chair yoga, chair Pilates, there's bad knees, bad hips, bad back. That's how I know about chair yoga. Stretching, aerobic exercise, it's all good. Walking, just as good for you as running. So physical exercise, really, really important. Cognitive exercise, also important. And cognitively stimulating activities are basically exercise for the brain. And here I can tell you the take-home message. Well, there's actually two take-home messages. One, it doesn't matter what you do. Again, it matters that you do. You like to read, please read. If you usually read romance novels, maybe try a mystery novel. Mix up your genres a little bit because the brain also loves novelty. And the more different kinds of things you can do in a given day that stimulate your brain, the better off you will be. You don't have to run out and buy some package or something. Just do things that engage you, that you like.
So I know we have a couple more questions. I just want to make one announcement because I know some people also need to leave. We do have a table right out front that has our information about this medical practice that you're hearing from today, which again is called Sunday Health. And Dr. Sanders is part of our group. We also have other clinicians. We practice in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and we are a telemedicine practice. That means we see you on your computer or your iPad. So if you do have questions beyond what we're taking today, or you would like to make an appointment with us, we are available, and the information is at the table out front, and I'm going to step out there in a second and answer any other questions you have about appointments. One nice thing about being a new practice is that we don't have a lot of wait time. So for any of you who may have been trying to get in to see a neurologist, an experienced neurologist like Dr. Sanders, you may know that it can take months. And because we're new and trying to build our practice, we don't have those wait times. We do take Medicare Part B. That is what we're taking right now, Medicare Part B. So advertisement over. I'm going to hand it over to this lovely woman here who has another question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders, for a terrific hour. My question is there any hope? Is there an amyloid blasting drug in the pipeline without grotesque side effects?
Well, yes, there is hope. I mean, this is the most exciting time of my career. And Alzheimer's disease and related dementia used to be really, really a pokey little one-horse town in terms of, National Institute of Health funded research and that sort of thing. We lagged way behind HIV. We lagged way behind cancer. When I finished residency in multiple sclerosis, there were a few drugs, I think 3. None of them were very impactful. There is now a list that is long as this arm, and it's beginning to happen for Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. There is not yet an amyloid busting drug that you can take once and get rid of all the amyloid and happy trails. But we do have drugs that clear amyloid. We're not entirely sure about the long-term impact of that amyloid clearance, some 20 years ago or so, there was a vaccine that in clinical trials did a bang-up job of clearing amyloid, which is exactly what you want, right? Except, oh dear, it also caused really, 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 and deadly side effects of a type of encephalitis. And I have a slide in some of my talks that shows the performance on the New York Stock Exchange of the pharmaceutical company that was trialing that vaccine. Went from, you know, just really, really, really excitement to, I mean, it just died. We now have 2 amyloid clearing FDA-approved medications. One of them is called lecanemab. The brand name is Leqembi. The other one, that's a Japanese word for beautiful or something like that, and one of the parent pharmaceutical companies is based in Japan. And then there's also one called donanemab. I don't believe, do we know yet that donanemab a brand name? Yeah, I don't think that's been announced yet. But they both clear amyloid, and that is probably a good thing, but they do cause side effects. And the side effects can be brain swelling and brain bleeding. And but it doesn't happen in everybody. And even if you have brain swelling and brain bleeding, it is manageable in most cases. And we can assess your risk, we can stratify your risk for those kinds of bad side effects by checking your ApoE status. Because the people who have those side effects are if people are strawberry, so E4, they're at much higher risk of the bad side effects. But disease-modifying drugs in Alzheimer's disease, oh my goodness, I really did not think I would see the day in my career. There's lots of things that we can do to help people who have Alzheimer's disease and their care partners and the people who love them, short of medications. But to have actual disease-modifying medications, and there are trials now that are going to look at medications that are going to affect tau, or other kinds of medications that work on inflammation, which we know is important. We haven't quite figured out fully in what way it's important, because remember, it's all so very, very multifactorial. But, so we don't have an amyloid busting drug per se yet, but there is hope. The paradigm is shifting, and I have never been so optimistic as I am now. So.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders, and all of you for being here today. I want to thank Jessica again from StrongerMemory, which is part of Goodwood Living. Thank you so much for inviting us, Jessica, and Dr. Sanders for sharing your deep knowledge. Thank you, all of you. We'll be out at the table if you have questions about the practice.